There's a photograph sitting in a drawer in my flat in Whitechapel, creased along one corner, a little sun-faded on the left edge. I took it on a Tuesday in October 2009, and I haven't been able to throw it away, even though, or maybe because, I still don't entirely understand what I captured in it. In the photo, there is a man. He's standing at his post outside the old Admiralty building on Whitehall, which most tourists walk past without really seeing, because it's not Buckingham Palace, and it doesn't have the horsehair hats and the famous stone-faced stare they've come to collect. He's in full ceremonial uniform, scarlet tunic, pressed to a geometry that seems inhuman, brass buttons catching a thin gray October light. His face is carved into something that is not exactly an expression. It is more like the removal of one. And in the background of the photograph, just visible over his left shoulder, slightly out of focus the way things you weren't trying to photograph always are, there are 3 men. 2 of them are looking at the guard. One of them is not. I've been staring at that photograph off and on for 15 years. Let me back up. My name is Patrick Osei. I'm a secondary school history teacher now. Back in 2009, I was 24, freshly landed from Accra, doing a postgraduate program at King's College, and burning through every free afternoon I had exploring the city like a man who believed the city was going to disappear if he didn't memorize it fast enough. I carried a camera everywhere. Not a phone camera, a proper secondhand Canon, one that I'd bought off a classmate for 40 quid and taught myself to use by pointing it at everything. Streets, pigeons, the way October fog sat on the Thames at 6 in the morning. Strangers' faces. I was trying, I think, to document the feeling of arriving, of being new somewhere enormous. That Tuesday, I had no class this afternoon. I made my way on foot from Strand up through Trafalgar Square, which was thick with tourists even in October, even in weather like that, gray and close and smelling faintly of rain that hadn't quite decided to commit, and then north up Whitehall with no real destination except the general direction of Parliament and the slow pleasure of walking without hurrying. Whitehall in October has a particular texture to it. The stone buildings carry a damp that never quite leaves, and the tourist crowd thins compared to July, but doesn't disappear. There are always groups. School trips with color-coded lanyards. Couples from Japan and Germany and Australia with matching rain jackets and careful maps. The occasional solitary person like me, holding a camera, pretending to be invisible. I'd stopped in front of the old Admiralty building because the light had done something interesting to the ironwork of the gate. One of those October tricks where the cloud breaks for exactly 40 seconds and everything bronze and brass goes briefly liquid, and I was trying to get the angle before it closed again. That's the only reason I was there. That's the only reason I was watching. The guard had been at his post when I arrived. I'd glanced at him the way you glance at anything fixed in a landscape, registering, cataloging, moving on. Ceremonial guards are part of the background of Whitehall the way lampposts are, or red phone boxes. You see them without seeing them. His name, I would learn much later, years later, through a chain of circumstances I'll get to, was Corporal Daniel Ashworth. He was 27 at the time. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for ceremonial duties. He was from a town called Matlock in Derbyshire, which I had to look up on a map when I found this out because I had, at that point, only a postgraduate student's geography of England, which is to say, London, and vague cardinal directions beyond it. I didn't know any of this when I saw him. What I knew, standing on the pavement with my cannon half raised, was that something had changed in him. It was barely visible. That's the thing I keep coming back to. If I hadn't been looking at him, if the light hadn't done what it did to the ironwork, if I hadn't already had my eyes fixed in his direction, I would have missed it entirely. But I was, and I didn't. His eyes moved, not his head. His head stayed level, chin set at that particular parade ground angle that looks like pride and is actually a kind of trained blankness. His body stayed locked, but his eyes, they tracked, left to right, slow and deliberate and completely at odds with the statue impression the rest of him was creating. I thought about this a lot in the years since. The discipline required to move only your eyes when every instinct is probably screaming at you to move your whole body, to turn, to face it, whatever it was, like being a hawk that has trained itself to hunt without shifting on its branch. I lower my camera slightly. Something about the quality of his stillness had changed. Before, it was ceremonial stillness, the performed immobility of a man doing his job. Now it was a different kind. The stillness of a man holding himself back from motion. Charged. Coiled. The difference between a parked car and a car with the engine running. I looked in the direction his eyes had moved. The three men were standing perhaps 20 meters away, on the opposite side of the pavement near the edge of the gate sight line. I noticed them, and then I noticed that I couldn't quite explain why I noticed them, which is its own kind of noticing. They weren't doing anything dramatic. They weren't arguing or running or causing any visible disruption. Two of them, the ones who were looking at the guard, appeared to be tourists. One had a blue windbreaker and a camera hanging around his neck. The other had what I remember as a gray hoodie, sleeves pushed up despite the cold. They were talking to each other in low voices. The third man was different. He was standing slightly apart from the other two. Not dramatically apart, not the kind of distance that announces itself. Just a half step removed. And where the other two were oriented toward the guard, the way tourists always orient themselves toward guards, that magnetic pull of spectacle, this third man was oriented toward the building. Not the guard, the building. He had a bag, a dark green canvas bag, the kind you might take to a market. He was holding it with both hands, low and in front of him, and he was looking at the Admiralty gates with an expression I can only describe as calculating. The way you look at something when you're measuring it. Not admiring. Measuring. I want to be careful here. I want to be honest about what I actually observed in that moment versus what I've layered onto the memory in the 15 years since. Because that's what memory does. It learns, and then it retrofits the learning onto the past until you can't quite separate what you saw from what you now understand. What I can tell you with certainty, I felt something. It was not a dramatic feeling. It wasn't the cartoon cold sweat alarm of a thriller. It was quieter than that, and therefore stranger. It was the feeling of being in a room and realizing slowly that the temperature has dropped. Not a sudden cold, but the kind that you notice only when you're already in it. I didn't do anything. I didn't say anything to anyone. I just watched. The guard's eyes moved again. This time I caught it completely because I was looking for it. The track was deliberate. Left then to the third man. A pause, the span of one breath, maybe two, and then back to center. And then something happened that I have replayed so many times it has worn grooves in me. A tourist walked up. An older woman, American from the accent that drifted over, gray-haired, sensible shoes, one of those waterproof coats that announces its own practicality. She stopped directly in front of the guard and began doing what tourists do, extracting her phone, angling it, deciding the angle was wrong, shifting a foot to the left. She was completely oblivious to anything except the framing of her photograph. And for a moment, just a moment, the guard's view of the third man was blocked. I saw the guard's jaw tighten. Not dramatically. The way a person's jaw tightens when they're trying to hear something over noise. The smallest muscular adjustment. The woman took 3 photographs. She said something to the guard. I couldn't hear it from where I was standing. Some comment or pleasantry. The kind that tourists offer to guards the way you'd offer a word to a statue you half expected might answer. The guard, naturally, said nothing. She moved on. The guard's eyes went immediately back to the third man, who was gone. I turned, scanned the pavement in both directions. The blue windbreaker tourist was still there, examining something on his camera. The gray hoodie was maybe 10 meters further along, hands in his pockets. The third man, the one with the green bag, the one who'd been measuring the gates, had simply ceased to exist in my field of vision. I looked back at the guard. He was looking at a fixed point somewhere past my left shoulder, and his expression, if you could call it that, had closed back down into the ceremonial blankness. Statue mode, present and absent simultaneously. But there was a faint thing happening at the corner of his mouth. Not a twitch. Something more compressed than that. The shadow of something being locked down. I lifted my Canon. I don't fully know why. I think I wanted to freeze the moment before I lost it. The way you sometimes photograph a thing when you don't yet have language for it. The camera was already up, and I pressed the shutter before I'd consciously decided to. The click was very loud in the relative quiet. The guard's eyes moved to me, only for a second, then away. But in that second, something passed between us that I have spent 15 years trying to name. It wasn't suspicion. He'd clocked I was just a man with a camera. It wasn't acknowledgement exactly, though it was closer to that. It was the look of a person who is aware of being seen and who is deciding in real time how much of that to register. Then the look was gone, and he was back to being architecture. I lowered my camera and stood there for another minute, maybe two, with the peculiar feeling of having witnessed something I didn't have the context to understand. Then I walked on the way you do. The city was still enormous. I still had hours of October light. I forgot about it. That sounds terrible, put plainly like that. But I did. Life has a way of absorbing its own strangeness. I had essays to write, a flatmate who played guitar badly and apologetically at all hours, a whole city to continue not understanding. The afternoon on Whitehall folded itself into the general accumulation of new city experience, which is voluminous enough that individual moments disappear into it the way stones disappear into a river. The photograph sat in a stack of other photographs. I developed everything in batches at a shop near Borough Market, and I didn't look at it closely for almost 2 weeks. When I did, it was late on a Sunday night, going through the batch the way you go through a batch, quickly and with diminishing attention. Most of them were atmospheric. A few were good. I was about to flip past the one of the guard when the background caught me. I held it under the lamp. The two men who'd been looking at the guard, windbreaker and gray hoodie, were in it clear enough. The third man, the one with the green bag, was not. But over the guard's left shoulder, partially obscured by the ironwork of the gate, there was a shape. Dark, green, low to the ground, near the base of the gatepost. The bag. He'd left the bag. I sat with that photograph for a long time. Then I went to bed and told myself I was probably wrong, probably misremembering, probably mapping my own anxiety onto ambiguous shapes in a slightly underexposed photograph. Probably that I went back to Whitehall 3 days later. I told myself it was because the October light was still doing interesting things and I had a free afternoon and the walk was pleasant. These things were true. They were also not the reason. The reason was the photograph. The green shape at the base of the gatepost. The third man's eyes, measuring. I am a historian by training, which means I have a professional relationship with incompleteness. I spend my days in the company of records that are partial, accounts that are one-sided, evidence that points in directions, and then stops. You learn in that discipline to sit with not knowing, to hold the gap open rather than papering over it with the nearest available explanation. But there's a difference between scholarly not knowing and the kind that hums at you from a drawer where you've put a photograph. One is clean. The other keeps you awake. The guard at the old Admiralty post that Thursday was not Daniel Ashworth. This one was younger, or at least he looked younger, though they all have that ageless quality when they're in full uniform, that peculiar effect of the ceremonial dress flattening individuality. He was slightly shorter. His stillness was correct, but less dense, if that makes any sense, less of the quality I'd seen in Ashworth, that sense of something enormous being held very quietly in check. I walked the length of the pavement, slowly, camera around my neck, doing what I'd done the first time. Pretending to be interested in the ironwork. The fog. The gatepost where I'd seen the green shape was clean. Of course it was. Whatever had been there, if anything had been there, was long gone, absorbed into the bureaucratic machinery of Whitehall, which has its own way of making things disappear without announcement. I stood there for a while, feeling slightly absurd. A man in a high-vis vest came out of a side door I hadn't noticed before and crossed the pavement to a parked van. Completely ordinary. The whole scene was completely ordinary, and I was a postgraduate student from Accra, standing outside a government building in October, holding a camera, and half hoping the city would offer me an explanation it had no reason to give. I took a few photographs. The new guard, the ironwork, the fog. Then I went home. The explanation, partial, incomplete, the historian's kind, came 11 years later. And it came sideways the way things do. It was 2020. The world had contracted to the size of a flat. And I was teaching history remotely to year 10s who kept their cameras off and who I suspected were doing other things while I talked. In the evenings, I was doing what everyone was doing, falling down internet holes, reading things I'd never read before, picking up trails, and following them just to have something to follow. Somewhere in an Army Veterans Forum, one of those online communities that functions as both record and therapy, I found a thread. It had been started by someone asking a very specific question. Has anyone ever stopped something and never been told what it was? The thread was 12 pages long. Most of the responses were vague or clearly dramatized in the way that online communities sometimes dramatize things. But about 4 pages in, there was a post from a user whose handle was something like Derby's Lad 07. The post was not long. It was written in the register of someone who doesn't write often and is trying to be precise. He said he had done ceremonial duty in London in 2007 to 2010. He said that on a particular afternoon that he didn't date specifically, he had observed a man behaving in a way that was inconsistent with normal tourist behavior near his post. He said that training tells you the difference between people who are watching you and people who are studying the building, and this man was studying the building. He said the man had left something at the base of the gate structure. He didn't say what, and that he had used the intercom system that runs inside the guardsman's box, which tourists cannot see, to alert his commanding officer. He said armed response had arrived within 6 minutes, which he described as the longest 6 minutes of his life. He said he was never told what had been in the bag. He said, I was told it was handled. That's all they said. Handled. And then they moved me to a different post for 2 weeks, and nobody mentioned it again. The post was from 2018. It had 4 responses, 2 of which were commiserations, and one of which was someone questioning whether the story was real. The 4th response was from the original poster, added 2 days after the thread started. It said, I'm not looking for validation. I know what I saw. I'm asking because I want to know if anyone else has had to just carry something like that without knowing what it was, without a name for it, because it's a strange kind of weight. I stared at the screen for a long time. Derby's Lad 07, Derbyshire, 2007 to 2010. Ceremonial duty on Whitehall. The probability calculation is something I have run many times and tried very hard not to run, because the historian in me knows that the urge to make pattern from coincidence is one of the oldest and most dangerous human impulses. People see constellations in random stars. They hear messages in static. The brain is a pattern-finding machine that will pattern find in the absence of actual pattern, and the result is called superstition or conspiracy, or sometimes just grief. I know this, and still, I created an account on the forum. I sent Derby's Lad 07 a private message. I said I was a historian and I'd come across his post, and would he be willing to speak with me further? He didn't reply for 3 weeks. Then, you can ring me. Here's a number. His name was, in fact, Daniel Ashworth. He told me this at the start of the call, in a voice that was quiet and Midlands accented and utterly matter-of-fact, the way some people deliver information that has been sitting in them long enough to lose its heat. We spoke for almost 2 hours. I had the photograph in front of me. I dug it out of the drawer when his message came and smoothed the crease along the corner and set it on the table, and at a certain point I described it to him in some detail. There was a silence on the other end. October, he said. 2009, yes. Fairly gray day. A tourist. Woman. American. Yes. Another silence. Longer. She walked right into my sight line, he said. I had him for maybe 3 minutes before she stopped. I could see him through her hair. Just barely. And then she moved, and he was, gone, I said. Gone. He was quiet again. I could hear very faintly something in the background of wherever he was, a television or maybe the radio, turned low. You saw me clock it, he said. It wasn't a question. Your jaw tightened. A sound that might have been a short laugh. That's what my wife says. While I'm trying not to react to something. She clocked it on our first date. Said, you've got to tell. A pause. Supposed to not have tells in that job. You were very still, I said. Otherwise, you train for it. You train, and then something actually happens, and it all collapses down to the training. Which is the point, I suppose. I asked him what he'd seen that day, the specific sequence. He was quiet for a moment, the way people are quiet when they're deciding how much to give, not whether to trust. I think he'd decided that already, or he wouldn't have given me his number, but how much of the private architecture of a memory to open up to a stranger's eyes. The two blokes were a misdirection, he said finally. I figured that out later. Whether they knew they were a misdirection or not, I can't say. They might have just been tourists, but they kept looking at me, and people who are actually up to something don't tend to look at the guard. They know not to. So there was something off about the pairing. The third man wasn't looking at you. No, he was working out angles. You can tell. It's a specific kind of looking. Methodical, like you're cross-referencing something against a mental diagram. In the bag, he set it down at the base of the post like he was resting it for a second. Very casual. Didn't crouch, just kind of lowered it. The way you'd put a shopping bag down for a moment while you checked your phone. Then he turned and walked. A pause. Normal pace. That's the thing. Not rushing. Just walk. You used the intercom. Straight away. Before he got 20 meters. I asked him what the intercom conversation had been. He said, I reported what I'd seen. Description of the individual. Location of the bag. They said wait. They always say wait. And you waited 6 minutes. Ish. His voice shifted slightly. Not in volume, but in texture. Something that had been smooth, going briefly rough. Longest 6 minutes of my life, and I've had longer minutes than most. Being in that post, just standing there, not knowing what was in the bag or whether I was right about it, or whether I'd flagged an innocent man leaving his shopping. I thought about that too, you know? What if I was wrong? What if I'd just ruined some tourist's afternoon for nothing? But you weren't wrong. They took it away. 5 of them in plain clothes. No fanfare. No visible panique. The way they do it when they don't want to cause a scene. They were practiced at the not causing a scene part. He paused. And then a 6th man, also plain clothes, also very practiced, came on my post and said, Good work, soldier. It's handled. I said the word back to him. Handled. Handled, he repeated. And they never told you more than that. A long silence this time. I was moved to Whitehall rotation 2 weeks later. Different post. The posting rotation was completely normal, standard procedure, nothing unusual. But you notice these things when you're trained to notice things. He stopped. I didn't push for information. You don't. That's a choice you make in that profession, or it's a choice the profession makes for you. I was never entirely sure which. How did it sit with you? He was quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then, like something unfinished, like a book with the last chapter torn out. Another pause. I know it was handled. Whatever it was. Nobody got hurt. The building's still there. So in one way, it was fine. It resolved fine. But there's a part of my brain that never got to close the file, you know? It still got the case open. We have spoken 6 times since that first call. He is not a man who shares things easily. This is not a character deficiency. It is the result of years of training that rewards containment, that treats silence as competence and expression as exposure. I've watched it loosen slightly over the course of our conversations. The way ground softens after sustained rain. What he has told me over those 6 calls is this. In the 3 months following the incident, there were 2 separate internal interviews conducted, separately, not together, not framed as a sequence, but which he understood, from the shape of the questions, to be connected. He was asked about what he'd observed. He was asked about his reporting process. He was not asked what he thought the bag had contained. He was not told. The official position, as far as he could reconstruct it, was that the matter had been resolved through proper channels and that the ceremonial guard in question had performed his duty correctly. Beyond that, nothing. What he knows for certain is that something was in the bag that warranted 5 plainclothes officers arriving within 6 minutes. He knows that the officer who spoke to him afterward had the particular expression of someone delivering a prepared sentence. Not lying exactly, but transacting a controlled minimum. He knows that 6 minutes is very fast. He knows that it's handled is not a nothing statement. In his experience, it is a very specific kind of something. It is the language used when the thing that's been handled is too significant to be casually named, but too sensitive to be documented in a conversation with a corporal at a gate. Something was planned, he told me on the fourth call. Not a question, a statement, a thing he had long ago arrived at, and was now simply saying aloud to another person for the first time. Something was planned, and I saw the man who was meant to start it set the starting thing down and walk away. And somewhere in some file in some building, there's a name for what that thing was. He paused, and I'll never know it. He said it without bitterness, without drama, with the precise, level quality of someone who has made peace with an open file. Not closed it, not resolved it, made peace with it, which is a different and harder thing. Does it still sit heavy? I asked. Sometimes, he said. Less than it used to. He paused again. I'm glad I was there. Whatever it was, I'm glad I was the one who was there. I've taught history long enough to understand something about the architecture of what we know. Every event that ever happened, every single one, has two versions. There's the version that gets named, documented, filed, given a date, and a classification, and sometimes a Wikipedia page, and eventually, if it's significant enough, a place in a curriculum. And then there's the version that lives in the people who were present for it, which is wider and stranger and more specific than any document can hold, and which dies piece by piece as those people die. The gap between those two versions is where I spend my professional life. What happened at the old Admiralty building on that October Tuesday in 2009, whatever it was, has a documentary version somewhere. A classification level, a file number. People who know exactly what was in the green canvas bag know what was in the green canvas bag. And somewhere that knowledge is written down in the language that institutional Britain uses to write down the things it would prefer not to discuss in public. And then there is Daniel Ashworth's version. 15 years of living with an open file. 12 years of not telling anyone. A Veterans Forum post at 11 o'clock at night. That was not, I think, about seeking validation, just as he said, but about the very human need to confirm that you're not the only person who has ever had to carry something without knowing its name. And then, at the corner of it all, creased along one edge and slightly sun-faded, my photograph. The last time Daniel and I spoke was a Sunday in March. He had called, for once. Usually it's me who initiates, and he sounded different. Not troubled. The opposite, almost. Like a man who has had a piece of furniture rearranged in a room he knows very well, and is still getting used to where the light falls now. He'd been at a regimental reunion. Men he'd served with, some going back to the pre-ceremonial years, the operational ones. Afghanistan. Other places he'd been that he has never named in detail, and I've never pushed on because the historian knows that some records are sealed for reasons that have nothing to do with state secrecy and everything to do with the right of a person to determine what is and isn't on offer. He'd had a conversation, he said, with a man who'd been in intelligence work for 20 years before he retired. He didn't tell me the man's name, or what branch, or when exactly this retirement had happened. He just said, there was a conversation. He didn't tell me what was in the bag, Daniel said. I want to be clear about that. He didn't tell me anything specific. But I said, but we were talking about how things move in those situations. The speed of response. What different response times mean? And I told him my 6 minutes, and he nodded. In a way. A pause. Like he recognized the number. Recognized it how? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Like it meant something to him. The 6 minutes. Like it placed the incident in a category he understood. He stopped again. He said, that's a certain kind of call, 6 minutes. And then he moved the conversation on. I held that. A certain kind of call, I said. Yes. What do you think that means? Daniel made a sound. Exhale, almost a laugh. Not quite. Honestly, I think it means it wasn't nothing. I think 6 minutes is not what they send for an abandoned rucksack full of someone shopping. I have thought for 15 years that I interrupted something. And what this man said in the way he said it confirmed, without confirming anything, that I was probably right. He stopped. And that's all I'm going to get, he said. And I think I've made my peace with that. Have you? A longer silence than usual. Getting there, he said. I'm getting there. I think about what it costs, the kind of getting there. We talk a great deal about heroism as though it is an event. A moment. The clean spike of a single decisive action. The alert, the call, the 6 minute response. And sometimes it is that. But what Daniel Ashworth has been doing for 15 years is a different and quieter kind of thing, and I don't have a word for it that doesn't immediately sound wrong. He stood at a post and used his training and his eyes and his judgment to interrupt something he was never permitted to understand. And then he went home to Derbyshire. Eventually, he's back there now. He works for a contractor that does security assessments for local councils. He has a wife who can still read his tells, and 2 daughters who he says are, both of them, terrifyingly perceptive. And he carried the open file. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way you carry something in a coat pocket. It's just there, slightly heavier than everything else, and occasionally your hand goes to it without your meaning to reach. I've been trying to write this piece for 6 months. Several versions of it exist in various states of unfinished on my laptop. This draft is the one that made it all the way through, and I'm honestly not certain why. It might be because I've stopped trying to solve it, stopped trying to give the story the last chapter was robbed of. I've written around the gap instead of into it. The gap is the point. The gap is where Daniel Ashworth has been living for 15 years, and it's where this story lives too. What was in the bag? I don't know. Dana doesn't know. Somewhere, someone knows, and that someone is either still bound by the architecture of official secrecy or is no longer in a position to tell anyone anything, because time does that. It dissolves the keepers of information along with the information itself, and eventually all that's left is the inference. Here is what I can infer. Assembled from 15 years of photograph, 2 hours on a veterans forum, 6 telephone calls, and 1 reported nod from a retired man at a regimental reunion. Something was planned. Someone was sent to initiate it. That person set the initiation down at the base of a gate on a gray October Tuesday, and then walked away at normal pace and disappeared into the city. Whether he walked away because the guard's comportment had told him he'd been made, or because his nerve broke, or because something else entirely intervened, that too is part of the open file. The response was fast enough to suggest the threat was classified at a certain level. Nobody was hurt. The building is still there. And Daniel Ashworth, who spent 6 minutes standing perfectly still at a post while armed officers arrived in plain clothes, who delivered his 6 minutes of stillness so precisely that no member of the public on Whitehall that afternoon had any reason to suspect that anything was happening at all. Daniel Ashworth was told it was handled and moved to a different post, and that was the end of the official record as far as he was concerned. I went back to Whitehall one more time last October. 15 years exactly. October light, the same quality of gray, the same smell of imminent rain not committing. I stood in front of the old Admiralty building for a long time with my hands in my pockets. No camera this time, just looking. The post was occupied. A different guard, obviously. The centuries of institutional rotation that make these buildings feel permanent and make the people inside them feel invisible in a specific way, the way all institutions make their human components feel invisible. This guard was young, 23, maybe 24. About the age I'd been when I stood in roughly the same spot with a second-hand cannon, and no idea what I was witnessing. His face was locked into the ceremonial blankness. His body was perfectly still. I watched him for maybe 10 minutes. In that 10 minutes, 3 tour groups passed. A cyclist nearly hit a pedestrian, and there was a brief eruption of shouting. A woman dropped her coffee and said something in French that I'm fairly certain was not polite. A pair of pigeons conducted a territorial dispute on the pavement directly in front of the gate with all the drama of a small parliamentary session. The guard's expression did not change, but his eyes were moving. Slow, continuous, deliberate. Taking it all in, registering it all, running it all through whatever calculus the training creates. Measuring it against the known baseline of ordinary. Looking for the thing that is measuring rather than watching. Scanning for the third man who isn't looking at the guard. This is what they do every shift, every day in the cold and the heat and the gray October in between. They stand still so that the rest of us can move. They hold the threat in focus so that we can be blissfully, usefully ignorant of it. Most of the time, there's nothing. And the times when there isn't nothing, the times when a green bag sits at the base of a gatepost on October Tuesday and armed officers arrive in 6 minutes in plain clothes, Those times also, mostly, resolve cleanly. Handled. No name. No file number that a corporal ever gets to open. No last chapter. Just the open file. Just the weight of the thing carried without a name. I sent Daniel the photograph last month. A scan of it, good resolution, properly lit. He looked at it for a few days before responding. When he did, the message was short. I can see it. At the gate. That green shape. I couldn't prove it to anyone, but I can see it. Then, you can see me too. I look younger. Then, a few hours later, a separate message. Thank you for going back. For seeing it in the first place. I didn't know anyone had. I sat with that for a while. The photograph was on the table in front of me. The original, creased at the corner, slightly sun-faded on the left edge. The guard standing in October light. Eyes moved to a fixed point just over the lens. The green shape at the base of the gate, half hidden by ironwork. A man. A bag. 6 minutes. And in the foreground, slightly soft, slightly out of focus. The way things you weren't trying to photograph always are, the ordinary city going on. Tourists moving. Pigeons. A woman in a waterproof coat who never knew, not for a single second, that the man standing behind her like furniture had just done something that might have saved her life. The most important things I've found tend to look like nothing from the outside. They tend to require someone who is standing in the right place with a camera in October light for the wrong reasons to look at them hard enough and long enough to begin to understand that they were not nothing at all. The photograph is still in the drawer. I don't think I'll ever throw it away. Some open files you carry. You carry them not because they're unresolved, but because they hold a shape that matters. Because the shape of a man standing still in the moment that counted without recognition, without explanation, without even the small dignity of being told what he stopped, that shape deserves to be held somewhere. It's in my drawer, and now it's here.